All right. Well, this Independence Day week, I figured who would be the best person to get on to contribute to this whole coverage? Richard V. Battle, of course. And Richard, you've done a lot of writing since we last talked, but I'm so glad to have you back on.
It's my pleasure, Alex. And yes, we're following up the Made in America by Americans, Not Americants book that we talked about last with some specific individuals that we profile in the Americans Who Made America series.
And I mean, that was quite a prolific series. And I would say, of those that you highlighted, did any of them that are living like talk to you about? Yeah, we were glad we were in the book. Did anybody react to it? Like, what was the reaction to that book before you?
Well, what's interesting, the people that I write about in these series are all people that have passed on.
Yes.
We did the 18th century book published last year and the 19th century this year, but I'm working on the 20th century. And I learned from some previous books that when you write about people that are still living, sometimes they may do something that you may wish you'd reconsidered.
Well, I'm sure one of the Americans that you think of a lot in this writing is John Adams. And as you know, on July 3rd, he wrote that famous letter basically saying there will be fireworks, there will be pomp, circumstance for celebrating July the 2nd. Of course, we celebrate July the 4th. But let's start with John Adams because he seems to have been such a pivotal role in the signing of the Declaration, right?
Well, he is. And one of my peeves is when people say Happy July 4th, because I think our citizens are forgetting what it's about. And so I like to say Happy Independence Day so they remember it's not about picnics and hot dogs. It's about our freedom that we ought to be celebrating every day. And yes, John Adams is one of the founders that I highlight. And yes, he wrote his letter to Abigail and communicated with her quite a lot. He was in Dutch, to use an old phrase, with some of the other founders because he defended the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre in their trial. So that was one thing that the founders didn't like him about, but he was a true patriot and worthy of our emulation. And what I try to do in this series of books is reveal and highlight their American do spirit, because to me, that's what's made our country succeed for the last 250 years.
And in other podcasts, I've said this. I'm going to ask you this. I feel like they were the first veterans of the country. I mean, we honor our veterans today, but they were veterans because they fought for our freedom.
Well, that's true. And what a lot of people forget is we remember the Declaration of Independence 1776, but really the independence movement started in 1765 after the Stamp Act. And we see the first person who I highlight, who you can say was a fatality of the Revolutionary War, was an 11-year-old boy in Boston, uh, Joseph Sider. He was there at a protest, and the British guy was holding a gun trying to fire a warning shot and hit him and killed him. And so he was the first casualty. That was about 2 weeks before the Boston Massacre. So this was in 1770, 6 years before the Declaration of Independence.
People do forget it spans even before even 775 is what I'm hearing. So
Well, yes. And you think about from 1765 until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, that's an 18-year span that our forebears lived and sacrificed and gave to us this great country. And we're not perfect. They weren't perfect. Our children won't be perfect, but we're better off and we're better people than most of the people around the world.
all right, I'm sure you have this figure because he's on the cover of your book and he is the first president in the United States. But again, people forget before being president, he led the Intercontinental Congress. He led the Intercontinental Army. I mean, he was at the forefront of everything. And I think of George Washington a lot around this time. Why not? Right? Because he's a pivotal part of all of this.
Well, the reason I put the picture of crossing the Delaware on there is I think that was the pivotal moment, the make or break moment in the whole movement. And George Washington, in my opinion, was the GOAT. He makes Tom Brady look like a rookie because he carried the revolutionary movement on his back. When everyone else was ready to throw in the towel and quit, his perseverance and persistence and efforts, he carried everyone on the back. And that Battle of Trenton, the day after Christmas in 1776, was the turning point, because after that, no one thought about quitting anymore. Everyone thought that victory was possible.
And it's funny you mentioned Battle of Trenton. I've had on a couple of people that have written about the Revolutionary War after 1770, the signing declaration. I mean, the war was still continuing on afterward, wasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, you had Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775, more than a year before the Declaration. The Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, the Battle of Saratoga, all kinds of military conflicts before the Declaration. Then after the Declaration, it was almost 7 years of fighting to win independence.
All right. Now let's talk about another guy that I'm thinking of during this whole week, Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, what is there some nuggets, some facts that we may not know about Thomas Jefferson?
Well, what's interesting to me, and so many of the founders were very young. Here he was born in 1743, so he was 33 years old. And you think about that. And what I think about, not only about him, but the other founders in my studies, was they put aside their personal ambitions and agendas to do what was right for the country with the Declaration, the war, and the Constitution. After that, they all reverted back to their personal agendas, like most politicians. But Jefferson was brilliant. He was selected to write the Declaration because of his skills. And if you go back and look, they realized that our human nature is imperfect. They put in there the imperfections of human nature, realizing that they couldn't get a perfect country. There never could be one. But I love the phrase, we pledge our lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, because those 56 guys that signed the Declaration, none of them gave up or turned on the other signers. They had 9 of them were killed, and 5 of them had been tortured and then died that way. Several had their houses burned down, their wives killed. One had 2 sons killed, another had 2 sons captured. They suffered mightily because once they put their name on the Declaration, the king put a death warrant out to them on them because of treason.
So the king basically didn't take it seriously, is what I'm hearing, right?
Well, no, he took it very seriously because he
In
put
the
a
sense
death
of he didn't,
warrant
he still
out.
thought that they were his subjects even after they declared independence, right?
Well, yes, he thought he could say that they were treasonous, would be one way you could look at that. But they were under a death warrant. So for them, it was victory or death, which was the password on the night that they crossed the Delaware River and fought in Trenton. Victory or death was the password.
Well, then let's get to the man who actually said the words, give me liberty or give me death. What do you got to talk about
Well,
with him?
Patrick Henry, first governor of Virginia, a very good orator. And here he, in a speech there in the Virginia House, stood up and gave an impassioned speech about the benefits and the needs to get into the independence movement. And that was the way he exclaimed his commitment. And what was interesting was the response of the audience. They bought into what he said and realized that we need to act. It's the time for talking is over.
And I feel like, and I would say a lot of these founding fathers were inspiration to those who served in World War One, fought in World War Two, because they saw what the founding fathers did and said, "Hey, if they built America, we can keep it going." That's why they fought. I mean, maybe I'm a little off base saying that the founding fathers inspired not even today's veterans, but the World War One veterans, the World War Two veterans, to keep fighting to keep the country safe.
Well, absolutely. And they should inspire us today and our children and grandchildren going forward, which is a big reason why I'm working on this, because I think our schools have failed us in teaching the history and the love of the country. They don't teach the civics. And so I think it's up to we citizens as parents and grandparents to teach our children to be patriotic and to appreciate the country. Let them know that we're not perfect and we've made some huge mistakes, but we're better than other countries because that's why millions of people try to come here all the time. They want what we have. And our founders gave that to us and set the stage and the example for that. It took every citizen then to win independence. It takes every citizen today to maintain and preserve it and perpetuate it.
And to keep us going to 400, 250 years later and beyond. All right. Because we want to continue the country, I think it's pretty impressive that for a very young country, we've had 47 presidents. I know multiple have served 2 terms, but the fact is, there's always been this transfer of power to keep us going. And so, in that regard, the presidents that have led this country, the 18th, 19th century, where do they figure in your books, Richard?
Well, again, I mean, George Washington is the GOAT, obviously. But I have a great respect for President Lincoln because of his holding the Union together, the challenges he faced, even to become elected. He lost several elections before he was ever elected to Congress or finally was elected president. So his persistence as well and his priority on keeping the Union together under threats from within and without his administration were unbelievable. Today, as we record this on July 2nd, was the second day of Gettysburg. And Gettysburg was the greatest threat to the Union during the Civil War. And that was the date that Joshua Chamberlain, who I profile in this latest volume about the 19th century, saved the day at Little Round Top when the Confederates tried to flank the Union Army. And if they would have done that, the Confederacy probably would have won the Civil War and we'd have 2 countries today instead of one. And Joshua Chamberlain's leadership that day saved the Union, saved Lincoln's election in 1864, in my opinion.
All right, we all are happy the Union beat the Confederates, right? However, I do want to say the tearing down of all these statues that come into play here. That we can't erase history. We can't tear down history like they're trying to do.
Well, that's exactly correct. And people have to go back and look at the situation. After the Civil War, I mean, 600,000 plus soldiers died on both sides. There was a lot of animosity. And what made it worse was Lincoln was going to have a very good Reconstruction period, bringing the South back in. But when he was shot, Reconstruction was much harder on the South than it would have been otherwise. So that created some animosity in the South that wasn't necessary. And so to try to bring the South back in, that's when they allowed some honoring of the Civil War generals because they fought on principle, even if the principle was disagreeable, and some other things. The city of Vicksburg, which was forced to surrender on July 3rd, did not celebrate Independence Day for 81 years until the middle of World War II. That's how much they resented the Union. And so we look back, and our forefathers brought the country back together and overcame that bitterness of that war. And people today ask me, do you think we can bring the country back together? And my answer is yes, but it will require great leadership, just like they had back in those days, and an understanding and a respect to bring people back together.
So let me ask you about the idea that this county did not honor 4th of July or Independence Day. Did you find that in your research? A lot of other counties did not honor Independence Day for quite a while.
Well, that's probably the preeminent one because of the bitterness of that siege at Vicksburg that lasted several weeks. And I mean, people were living in dirt caves and eating rats. It was a very bitter situation. And so they had a grudge, if you will, against the North that they exercised until World War II. And so individually, I think you could find people that held hard feelings if they had relatives that died and suffered and they felt were abused, just like you would in any other situation.
Richard, I find it interesting that 250 years after we're honoring Paul Revere's ride, that really alerted the British were coming. 250 years ago, around this time, we're fighting to be free. I mean, the fight was continuing on. Yet there were kids out there, and I say kids because a lot of them were very young, saying no kings. I don't think they understand that we already beat a king and we declared independence from them. And I don't believe the president is a king. But don't you find it ironic that was the name of their protest when really we had that fight 249 years ago and
Well, it
beyond?
is very ironic. They're trying to hang a reputation on him for political advantage, and I can understand doing that. But if you stand back and look at it, it is kind of humorous in a way because we've already beaten the king. And if you'll remember, in 1812 we went to war against Britain again, and again had to preserve the country. And in 1814 in Baltimore Harbor, the British attacked Fort McHenry. And if they would have won that fight, if those soldiers in that fort would have surrendered and taken the flag down the night of 1814 in September, the British would have won the war and we would have reverted back to being British again. But those soldiers held all through the night. Francis Scott Key, who I profile in the 19th century volume, Francis Scott Key, who was against the war. He was on a prison ship that night because he tried to help a prisoner be let loose. And he witnessed, and they got up the next morning to see the flag was still there. And he was so emotional because he realized that if the flag was down, the country was lost. And he wrote our national anthem, which was a Star Spangled Banner is the name of it, 2 days after that siege because he was so emotional and so patriotic for the country.
Did that get him released from the prison ship? I have to ask now that I did not know he was a prisoner in that moment.
Well, he wasn't a prisoner. He was an attorney who was hired to go on the prison ship and help a prisoner, help them release a prisoner. And when he went on the ship, they released the prisoner, but they held him because they knew they were going to attack Fort McHenry, and they didn't want him leaving and going back and telling the U.S. Army what was going to happen and help them defend against the British attack. And so once the attack was over, the British ships withdrew, and basically that was their high water mark of where they knew they weren't going to win that war.
It's a little different, but it kind of reminds me of the journalists that are in these signal chats now, knowing all the war plans. They don't want to let them go because they don't want it to be leaked out. But it's interesting.
Well, that's exactly right. And so we overlook those things. And so when I hear the Star Spangled Banner now, it means more to me once I've studied his story a little bit. And these stories I write about are where people from upper middle school and up can read them. Parents can read them to children. I try to, they're very easy. I have 258 quotations in the 18th century book, 358 in the 19th century, because I want these people to have their own voices. And when we read those quotes, it's so inspirational how much love they had for their country and for we, the citizens.
Have you worked with historical societies to get all these writings in the book? Like, because I saw Massachusetts Historical Society preserved Adams's letter from 1776. Do you work with those kinds of societies as well?
Well, I speak and present to the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the Republic of Texas. And so I'll do things like that and do research. Their mission's a little bit different, although we like to speak to groups like that. What I'm trying to do is not have a definitive history. I'm trying to highlight. It's almost like, to use a sports axiom, it's almost like a profile or a scouting report, if you will, on that person. And so I don't report their entire biography. I just look for that internal spirit in their heart that gave them the American-do attitude, because they went out and did things that they wanted to do or needed to be done. They didn't wait for government to show up to help them or ask anybody's permission. They went out and made things happen.
All right. In this 2 centuries that you cover, obviously your state became a state. So do you cover how Texas became a state and after the war, that war and all that?
Well, I highlight two Texans so people couldn't call me too prejudiced, but Sam Houston's one of my favorite leaders. And for Texas, he was our George Washington. He was the commander in chief of the army that won independence. He was the first and third president of our republic. He became a governor. He was the only Southern governor to vote against secession in the Civil War and got kicked out of office for it. But I also added something else I didn't learn. And to me, it's the greatest inspirational story. And that is his mother. When he was 19, he was going to leave to go off with Andrew Jackson to fight in the War of 1812. And his mother took him out on the back porch to bid him goodbye and said, "If you're courageous, you'll always be welcome here. If you're a coward, never darken my door again." And then she gave him a small gold ring, and on the inside of it, so only he could see, was the one word, honor. And I can envision him he wore that ring every day the rest of his life, over 50 years. He died with that ring on. It's at the museum outside of Houston for San Jacinto, where the battle that won the war is. And I can just see him when he had difficult decisions to make, sitting there twisting that ring and that word honor coming up to him. What's the honorable thing to do? And so what I'm saying is his mother influenced his leadership and his actions. She indirectly influenced Texas and America in the past, present, and will in the future because of what he did. And she died 30 years before Texas was a republic. So she never got to see any of that. And I tell people when I speak, I wish my parents would have given me an honor ring. And I encourage them to consider to give their kids honor rings as well. We never know what influence we may have in the future and beyond our lifetimes.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure every governor of Texas sort of has Sam Houston in the back of their mind because of what he did for Texas. So
absolutely, as well as many other people.
Absolutely. And by the way, Richard has served alongside the governor, I believe, in it's the Energy Council. Which council was that, Richard?
Well, Governor Perry, a few years back, appointed me to the Texas Judicial Council and the Texas Emerging Technology Fund to serve as a citizen representative.
Well, let's talk about judicial, because I want to go back to this no kings thing, and it drives me nuts that they're not seeing that the king really seems to be the federal judges that have a power over the whole land. Is that what the founding fathers wanted, Richard, for one judge to make a land for the whole land?
Well, we don't think so. And the Supreme Court certainly ruled last week, making that more difficult as well. And so that's one of the things about having a republic with our balance of powers and checks and balances is you'll have different branches of government that will try to become more powerful. And trying to keep the three of them balanced is an ongoing process. And so that's why each branch kind of restrains so that two of them don't gang up on the other one, if you will. All three of them are working independently against the other two. And so to me, this is a great example of the judicial branch getting a little bit out of their realm, if you will, and getting too powerful. And the Supreme Court, I think, will rein it in.
Amazing, like ganging up, because I remember before Joe Biden's term was done, everybody was pushing Elena Kagan out because she wasn't. There was something, or was it Sotomayor? One of them was not having. There was a health issue there. They wanted them out, so Biden can appoint another. There's a bloodthirst there in some sense on the left that I don't like, but that's another subject for another day. But I will tell you this. Speaking of judge and all that, I don't think our founding fathers wanted political judges, because I feel like a lot of this is based on politics, not actual law.
Well, that's one unfortunate thing. Our institutions have become politicized more and more and more over the last several years. And the last one to do so, but it is now, is the Supreme Court. And I think evidence to what you say is in our Constitution, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court's the only branch that's written about in the Constitution. All of the other courts have been constructed through Congress and the other branches of government. And so they're all subsidiary to the Supreme Court. And of course, they can be changed by Congress as well.
You know, as we're talking about the expansion of America in this 18th, 19th century, where do Lewis and Clark fit in? Because I feel like they were major players in all of this.
How did you know? I wrote about them also. So the first book has 40 profiles. The second one actually has 42 because two of the chapters have two people in it, and one's the Lewis and Clark expedition. We have to remember they left just outside of St. Louis in 1804, traveled all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back over 2 years. They lost one man to appendicitis. It's amazing. At that time, it would have been like us going to the moon today. Once they left, they had no support, no friends whatsoever. They had to find their own food, navigate, overcome any adversity. They had Native Americans to worry about, all kinds of issues, yet they went out, looked at the trail. They didn't find a over the mountain path or river to the ocean that went all the way, and then came back. Their mission was an incredible story. And there's a great book called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose that talks about it. And I wish they'd make a movie or a series about it, because it's an incredible story of what they did.
Oh, unbelievable. I believe how Louisiana and all these states became. Now, the Manifest Destiny, where we did expand to the West, was there, I feel like all this goes back to the Founding Fathers. Was that inspired by what the Founding Fathers did to begin with? Like, okay, now let's take this a little further out. Let's take it further west.
Well, I think that's part of it. And just in a simplified manner, I think part of it was wanting to grow the country, because if we grew the country, we could defend ourselves better. Part of it was we had other colonial powers that still had land holdings on our continent. So that was a threat to our national security. So if we expanded, they would be reduced and eventually eliminated, which would help us protect ourselves. And then if you go back and look at Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine, basically it said to the European countries, stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we won't try to colonize in your hemisphere, again, to help us protect. And so there was a lot of different factors on that I think helped us as a country to grow.
I'm thinking about the military, because they're also a reason why we grew. And in the 18th, 19th century, you had, unless Patton was 20th, but you had Patton, you had Custer, you had, I know he was a Confederate, but Robert E. Lee is part of all this. Ulysses S. Grant. So let's go to that. 250 years of the military. Where do the generals rank in your book on these legends here?
Well, I think Washington has to rank number one.
And Washington, yes.
Because without him, we wouldn't be here. We'd still be wearing red coats like that. I think that Ulysses S. Grant, who later became a two-term president, is another one, because Lincoln had such a hard time finding generals who would fight and lead. And once he discovered Grant, and Grant started out very humbly. He'd been in the military and went to the Mexican-American War, left the military war, failed at all of his private industry ventures. But once he came back into the military, into the Civil War, his leadership was so good that he kept becoming promoted until Lincoln had him lead the entire Union Army. And they called U.S. Grant, they call him unconditional surrender, but he realized that they needed to be aggressive and prosecute the war as rapidly as possible for victory, as well as to minimize the casualties and the suffering of the people.
And of course, he navigated the whole surrender, really, of the Confederates, which was pretty remarkable as well. And of course, if you ever get to New York, Grant's tomb is up here in New York City. You got to check that out if you haven't already. So it's we honor him up here for sure.
Well, he deserves it very much so.
And then the other generals, because Patton obviously is another legend of that whole era. And then I want to ask you why military generals are not as revered as they were back then.
Well, that's interesting, because up until Dwight Eisenhower, it used to be that some of our greatest military generals ended up becoming president. And that in the 19th century, I mean, there were more than a half a dozen of them that did, and it was because of that leadership. Well, since World War II, that's left us quite a bit from the standpoint of trying to separate military from civilian. I think at our loss, because some of those top generals like Eisenhower, Patton wasn't president, but he was a great general. MacArthur, unbelievable leaders. Some of those people had to lead us in the most trying of times. And so Eisenhower's ability to change from a military general to a civilian president was amazing. In the 1950s, when he was president, people laugh about it when they talk about those times, at least part of the people do, but they were peace and prosperity, single income households that were middle class and above. And so they were some really great days in our country.
All right, we both know that we're sort of on the conservative leaning. We honor America. Not to say all Democrats hate America. Okay, I'm not saying that. But did you find in your research some Democrats that were worth noting in the 18th, 19th century?
Well, I think the main thing I would say is even in my lifetime, I can remember when both parties were patriotic, both parties loved the country, both parties wanted what's best for the country versus other countries. And I think part of that has been a movement toward where people want a single world government and they think there's no borders, we're all the same. They differentiate our sovereignty type situation. John F. Kennedy, I mean, was a Democrat worthy of our reverence as well. Harry S. Truman, I mean, unbelievable. Here he was a failed guy in business, a haberdasher. And when he became president, he didn't even know about the atomic bomb that was being developed because he had only been in office about 40 or 50 days and he hadn't even learned about that yet. But he was a very humble leader. And when he left office, there was no Secret Service. He drove himself and his wife home to Missouri. There was no pretense. He was just a normal citizen at that time. And so, yes, there are people from both parties that I believe have that American-do spirit, and I don't think parties should preclude it.
All right, on the topic, because obviously, look, I think the founding fathers created this country because they wanted people to flee where they're in trouble, in these war-torn countries. And it's amazing to me that we look back and see Clinton, Obama, and all these guys did advocate for deporting the violent illegals. I don't know where all this changed. The point is, the Democrats and Republicans were in lockstep with that for a long time, that they did need to get rid of those who were not contributing here.
Well, that's exactly correct. And remember, Congress creates immigration laws. Most of our immigration laws were created, especially the last major legislation in 1965 was created by a Democrat Congress. Congress can change those laws. The correct term in the congressional bills is illegal alien. Some people won't even say that now. So they talk today about farm workers. Well, we have a visa program now that admits over 300,000 farm workers every year. So if that's not enough, Congress can change that number so we can have more visas issued each year. The thing that's really kind of holding all that up is one side insists on amnesty for all of the illegals that are in today, when amnesty will just encourage more illegals, as we found out in the 80s when Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to 3 million of them.
I got to ask you this, Richard. The Congress, and I believe Washington created the Congress as well back in the 1775. Would that Congress be happy with today's Congress?
Well, in Congress, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 wrote the Constitution. They created the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But I don't think they would be happy with what they see today, because while they created these checks and balances and tried to have the division of power so no one or institution could have too much power, I think they would be appalled to see how people have gone to just putting party over country, and where people vote in lockstep for or against items based on just it being their party situation. I think that they didn't put term limits in because they never dreamed anyone would stay in office very long. Because back in those days, Ulysses S. Grant went broke. He had to write his memoirs to try to pay his bills, for example, before he died of cancer. Nobody got rich off government until, really, if you start looking at it, after World War II. And once politicians started getting rich off government, Then they stayed, and this is both parties, oftentimes until they were drug out their bodies feet first. And so I'm a big believer in term limits because I think it's better if more citizens have a chance to serve, put fresh ideas in, and people are less beholden to lobbyists and other interests.
Well, it's interesting because I did a little lobbying for my disabled community in March. It felt like a very good experience though because I was able to get in their ear, and sure enough, Schumer votes for the budget a week after the meeting. I don't know if we had a say in it, but there's some good lobbying that goes on as well. I will
Well,
say that.
absolutely. But what I'm trying to convey is, in my opinion, the longer that a single politician stays in office, the more opportunity there is for corruption and them to get further away from the people, forgetting who they serve and thinking that they're ruling over those people. William
On
F.
that
Buckley
note,
Jr.
oh,
said, I'd rather be governed by the first 535 people in the New York City phone book than Congress because of things like that.
on that note, would the 1787 Congress consider it treason that these politicians are making money on insider trades? It's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard, but it does happen, and I feel like there should be some punishment for it.
Well, absolutely. And Congress, unfortunately, creates its own ethics or lack thereof. And we've seen that over the last several years when you see people serving up there's net worth increasing exponentially compared to others in the country. And I think it creates an atmosphere which is not healthy. And again, the only solution to me is term limits, which the Congress will never vote on. You have to have a constitutional convention to
Mm.
do that because they cannot restrain themselves, unfortunately.
You know, I don't think he's going to do it, but when Trump flirts with a third term, does that bother you? I have to ask you now, we're on term limits.
Well, I don't take that real seriously. I think that's just a way to try to get people who don't like him upset.
Well, we can only hope because that would certainly upend a lot of things, but I don't think it's going to happen. Um,
No.
Richard, I've asked you this before about Americans and Americans. I want to ask you about this series as well. Schools, are schools buying this book? Are they putting it on their kids' desks? Like, what's going on there with the schools?
Well, we hope so, and we're trying to get the word out, and anything you or your listeners can do to get the word out. I've had a lot of people, especially when I speak, who will buy a copy for each of their kids or grandkids. I've had people buy copies to give to their town or school libraries, and so we're looking for people to get the word out so young people can learn about these people and be introduced to our great country, unlike they may be in school. And so I'm open and would love to hear from your audience. Any way we can help or be helped by them to get the word out as much as possible.
All right, I got to ask about one guy that's actually being uh, sort of portrayed on off Broadway right now at the AMT Theater. Dr. Joseph Warren. Do you cover him
Oh,
in the book as well?
yes, I absolutely. Joseph Warren is a big hero in the 18th century volume. And he's a founder that's not as well known, but deserves it because he was killed before the Declaration of Independence. So he was a leader in the independence movement in Boston. Since he was a medical doctor, he could move around the city. So he gained a lot of intelligence of what the British were doing. But he was a leader to the other founders. He was the one that gave Paul Revere and William Dawes their direction to ride, their midnight rides, if you will, before Lexington and Concord. And when the Battle of Bunker Hill was getting ready to be fought, he could have stayed behind the lines and treated the wounded. But he stood up and said, hey, there's nothing special about me. If I'm going to advocate to go out and fight for freedom, I should be willing to go out there just like anyone else. In a speech just before that, when he was exhorting the patriots, he talked to them about freedom and he said, act worthy of yourselves. He was inspiring them. And unfortunately, he was killed at Bunker Hill there in June of 1775. And so he doesn't get the credit that he deserves because of that.
I swear, we could talk historical figures all day because I feel like we have that in excitement when it comes to this history and historical talk. Of course, you mentioned the flag was still there, and we all know about Betsy Ross. Where does she figure in your, your books?
Well, Betsy Ross is included, and she's a very important person because Washington had her make early flags. She made more flags than just that one, which is very important as well. She's not the only woman that I highlight. Some that other ones some you wouldn't, but a very important person. And again, uh, you may look at the ones I highlight, and you may know some of them. Hopefully, you won't know everything I write about, but your kids and grandkids that come behind us will know fewer of these people than we do. And that's the sad thing. They should know as many, if not more, than we know. And that's part of my project.
And of course, Pennsylvania. I got the Philadelphia fireworks behind me in this shot here. Ben Franklin, the actual representative from Pennsylvania, he didn't just discover electricity. He didn't just, it wasn't the key thing, right? There was more than that.
Oh, he was incredible. He was an inventor, a scientist, a leader. He was a diplomat. All these things he did, and he was the oldest of the founders. And what was interesting was in the Constitutional Convention, once they finished and they went outside, a woman asked him, and this is a very famous phrase and quote. She asked him, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government did you give us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And that's what's important today. Our politicians talk about democracy. Democracy is different than a republic. A democracy is only one step above mob rule because it's the majority rules. Well, a republic gives us individual rights. A republic protects the political minority from being abused by the majority. Aristotle said almost 2,500 years ago, republics decline into democracies. Democracies degenerate into despotism. And it illustrates that that republic is very precarious. And so we need to push elected officials. It's not a democracy. We are a republic. We have individual rights that we're guaranteed based on our Constitution.
Well, Richard, year 249 is upon us. I look at it as now. Now the countdown begins on July 2nd. 365 days from now, we will honor 250 years since we approved the Declaration of Independence. That's going to be a big moment, and I know we're going to catch up before then. But Richard, enjoy all of this and enjoy your Independence Day. And I would say happy 4th of July, but happy Independence Day because that's what it really is.
Well, happy Independence Day to you and your listeners. We hope that we're with you multiple times before then. People can
Absolutely.
find me at
You have,
Richard
but I like
Battle.
to call you have one leg up on history. That's what it is.
Well, thank you. Our website's richardbattle.com. I can be contacted richard@richardbattle.com. We'd love to hear from people. Anything we can do to spread the word, we'd love to do. And we always finish our conversations with God bless America.
God bless America. Thanks so much, Richard.